So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you very much for coming today online on Zoom, and look forward to see all of you second half of September in Davos, Switzerland, where we would plan to organize our first in reality one-to-one summit since 4 years. But today we have a very special occasion with a very special person. This is the next of our masterclasses, the World Communications Forum masterclasses. My name is Maxim Behar, president of the forum, but it's much more important that I'm a friend of the speaker today, a very, very high estimated and big professional. This is our friend from South Africa, Thabisile Phumo. Thabisile, I met Thabisile first time 7-8 years ago in Johannesburg, in a beautiful hotel where the South African PR Association had its annual forum, public relations forum. And at that time, Thabisile was the president of the South African PR agency. And we have René Beneke, very high estimated professional as well, good friend who was at the forum at that time as well. Thabisile is now Executive Vice President of Head of Stakeholder Relations in Sibanye-Stillwater. And as I said, she was the president of PRISA, and these days she is a very high estimated executive committee member of the World Communications Forum Association. Basically, we are 5 people in the executive committee. Now you have 3 of them: Stuart Bruce from the United Kingdom, Thabisile, and me. And then we have 2 more, a lady from Vietnam, Mai Yan, and Aaron Quitcomb from the United States. I would like also to introduce to you Zofia Bugaina, who is the manager of the whole project called Masterclasses. So with a couple of words, of course, Zofia, I will give you the floor to say a couple of words also at the beginning. I would like to present the topic today. Thabisile will give her expertise on what is the brand voice and why it is important in creating relationship and target audiences. By the way, brand is something which is terribly important in South Africa. Every time I go there, every South African I meet, they talk about brands for one or another reason. They have a perfect brand, Nelson Mandela, the late Nelson Mandela, who made South Africa famous all over the world. But also they have millions of other brands in the country. So Thabisile will explain us what is the importance of tone in amplifying the brand voice, how to speak, how to behave, how to emphasize important things concerning the brand awareness, how to enhance your brand messages, how to get the audience to choose it as a brand or voice. What are the key tools and techniques for effective messaging? To cut the long story short, she will explain how to sell us, either to clients or to the public, or, I don't know, boyfriends, girlfriends, maybe not, Thabisile, but you will explain. So, Zofia, a couple of words for the beginning, and then we start our class. Thank you very much, Thabisile Mandla, and Zofia has the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Maxim. I'm very happy that we meet here in such a large group. It's really amazing, and it's also amazing because today we are touching very essential thing for our profession. So, Thabisile, I believe that what you share with us will open our eyes on the substance of the brand communication and how to communicate today in the age of social media, in the age of digital-driven campaigns, in the age of such big transformation in media. So the floor is yours, and I'm really keep my fingers crossed for for this part of our masterclasses.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Madame Thabisile Phumo, from the heart of beautiful African continent, Republic of South Africa.
Thank you so much to everyone who's made the time to join this masterclass. It is always very difficult to present to experts about something that they already know. So what I'm going to attempt to do is actually not dwell on the academic side of it, but really look at what are just some of the practical things that I think as practitioners we can look at to amplify and enhance the value of our brands. And so thank you to everyone who is here. Jessica, I'm just going to time myself so that I don't go over time. If you can indicate if I missed the time boundary. Thank you so much, Maxine. So, but basically, if we really start looking at brands themselves, I was very intrigued as I was looking at this work, where I saw a very simple definition that just says a brand is a voice, a product is a souvenir. Then as I looked up brands and you look at Mercedes-Benz, they are producing any class of car. What you are buying is their brand promise. It's not the model. So you could be driving an A-class, you could be driving a Maybach, but what you are buying is the message, the promise that Mercedes-Benz has given to you as a client. Similarly, when you buy Apple, if you just look at the history of how Apple started as a company, they were a computer company, they're now into anything and everything that enhances our lives. You begin to see that actually people don't buy the product, they buy the brand. Similarly, for those who are into high-end brands like a Louis Vuitton, aspirational brand, again, people can buy a small purse, luggage, or whatever brand it is. But what they are buying, it's what the brand stands for, what it offers them as an audience, not so much the products, because then you can expand within any product range because people believe in your product. So if you look at Mercedes-Benz, it tells you about their drive, its elegance. You look at Apple, it's telling you how it's making your life easy. And so people latch on to that as a brand. So as we go through the masterclass, I just want to focus on what is the brand purpose and importance of that, the value of your brand voice in mobilizing your audiences, the importance of your tone, enhancing your brand messaging for impact, and of course, looking at how to get your target audiences to choose you as a brand of choice. And lastly, I will just make some recommendations in terms of tools and techniques, which I would hope would be effective in terms of your brand messaging. But obviously, we cannot talk about brands without thinking about what is the core of branding. Brands have a purpose. Why does your brand exist? And I think a lot of brands that have been long-standing, I mean, you look at Mercedes-Benz, in fact, earlier you spoke about Nelson Mandela. These brands, or even the US, if you look at country brands as well, these brands have got a purpose. There's clarity on why they exist. But most importantly, there's clarity to the audiences why they must consider those brands. I mean, if you look at the work that Simon Sinek has done in this work, he says there are only two ways to influence human behavior. You can either manipulate it or inspire it, but ultimately, people buy why you are doing it, not necessarily what you do. So if you've seen the work Simon Sinek has done around the why, starting with the why, and in fact, he uses Apple as one of those brands where he begins to say, Apple didn't start by saying we are selling phones and therefore, or laptops, therefore buy laptops. They spent a lot of time in their brand engagement and in defining their brand voice, telling their audiences why Apple exists, the higher purpose calling for Apple, and how Apple would interact and intersect with audiences to enhance their lives through their products. And when people begin to latch onto the why of the brand, it becomes easier for you to then expand and extend your brand architecture, portfolio, services, and products to infinity. so long as people now understand why you are who you are. And like human behavior, again, Maxine, you were talking about relationships as well. Again, even in personal branding, people don't really always look at what you do, because you could change what you do over time, but they look at why you do it, and they latch on to you in that relationship on the basis of why you do what you are doing. With that in mind, then we need to begin to ask ourselves a question. Why are brands successful? It has been discovered that brands that are successful are brands that are able to align their brand personas to their brand purpose. And here you can use your simple, your brand archetyping model, where you use it to obviously define your brand personality and what are the associated values with your brand. And now why that is critical, it enables for people to differentiate the brand, to know who you are as a brand and what you stand for, but most importantly, how you show up in the marketplace as a brand. Now, once you are able to do that, then you are able to niche your voice. In this day and age, all the brands are talking. There are big brands, there are small brands, there are copy brands. And for you to be able to be a distinguished brand, you need to find your niche. And the only way you can find your niche is if you find your position, clarify how you look, how you show up, so that when people see you or hear you as a brand, they can be able to identify you. So it almost eliminates the issues of brand confusions. Most important in that is the work you therefore need to do in the definition of your persona to define your tone. Audiences and stakeholders respond to brands that know how to communicate with them, brands that are familiar to them, brands that have got a consistent brand tone, such that, you know, you are finding in some instances the one day the brand is very abrasive and the next day the brand is very authentic. It almost creates audience confusion to an extent that they are also unable to have affinity to that brand, because they literally don't know how that brand talks, what it sounds like and what it looks like. And therefore you find that a lot of people then drop those brands that are not what we would call stable brands that are consistent. And of course, I talk about the issue of brand congruency. When you look at brands that are successful, those brands are congruent in a sense that the way they sound, the way they look, the way they express themselves, their brand promise and brand values, and the way they communicate are congruent. So you cannot, for instance, be a Sage brand and be communicating as a Maverick brand, as an example. And so people do look for congruency, but also they do look for congruency in how the brands show up in issues that matters to stakeholders, in issues that matters to anyone that is associated with that brand, which is therefore important for anyone who's driving brand to appreciate the fact that irrespective of the kind of brand that you have, consistency will always remain key. And therefore the guidance, or rather the advice for anyone driving brands is to actually, I would say, spend time or waste time defining your persona, spend time or waste time defining your tone, niching your voice, so that people can hear you from far, can distinguish you from other stakeholders, because people listen to things that they are familiar with, and people will seek out your brand in the crowd because they know what your brand feels and looks like. And of course, I've just started speaking about the tone. You've heard about the brand chart. I've just used a reference source here in terms of the different ways from a brand charting perspective. But really what we are looking at here is, again, defining your brand characteristics in the way your voice shows up, being very clear in terms of the tone of your voice, so that you can resonate you with the audiences. And as Elia said, you really have to define how you want to come across as a brand. A lot of brands, because of competition, because of new technologies, are literally abandoning strategies for popularism in terms of brand presentation. And as a result, they lose out on standing their ground in terms of how their brands must come across. And sometimes, if you're really being facetious, you could literally say technology has changed over the years, but brands haven't. And therefore, as we look at how we define ourselves, how we show up, whether we use new media or old media, it's almost important that your brand strategy is clearly defined and can be consistent, transcending any technological advances. Because I mean, you've got people like myself who started during the days of DOS and fax machines at the time, and now here we are with new technology, and I'm sure there'll be more discovered. And as you discover new technologies, your brand should be able to transcend all of those, because it's not about the mediums that you use, but it's how you've defined the character of your brand. And of course, if you're able to set the right voice and the right tone, then you are able to inspire your audiences, inspire them into associating with your brand, inspire them into wanting to be associated with your products. And if you look at brands as an inside-out activity, it also gives you an opportunity to create your own brand ambassadors within your own organization. Because in the ultimate end, and earlier I spoke about brand ambassadorship, people buy brands that have got internal ambassadors who endorse those brands as well. So if you look at companies like Virgin that have got a higher internal endorsements, those brands tend to be have a higher affinity than the other brands. And of course, you need to guard against what we call tone deafness, because it is important to highlight that some brands are tone deaf and they are not able to pick up incidences where their stakeholders are requiring a different kind of toning. And of course, if you use the brand chart, you are able to then look at the different characteristics of brands. And this then enables you to be able to know what are the do's and don'ts in terms of how you show up in your languaging, how you show up in your tone, in as far as that brand is concerned. Next to that, obviously, is the issue of the value of your brand tone. Once you've defined your brand personality, once you have defined how you want to show up, it is important to appreciate that then you are able to begin to create value for your brand voice, because people then will know your voice. They will know your tone. Most importantly, they'll begin to understand your voice, but they'll also be able to understand your tone. And where this becomes important is when your brand is in a crisis, because of the equity and because of the consistency of your brand and voice. Even when your brand is in crisis, people are able to identify your brand and your tone when you are in a crisis. And of course, what this then does, it helps you to provide for what we call a common language between yourself and your stakeholders. And when you look at stakeholder engagement framework, you will begin to realize that brands that are more represented, have higher affinity, are brands that seem to have what you can term a common language or lexicon between themselves and their stakeholders or audiences, because those brands have invested time in making their stakeholders understand who they are, how they come across, what are the kind of words they would use as a brand, to an extent that you find that their stakeholders are now familiar or have created common language between the brand and themselves. And of course, if you look at it from a human behavior perspective, and as earlier Simon Sinek said, how you inspire people, familiarity breeds affinity. People go for brands that they're familiar with. So if you look at Mercedes-Benz, from when it was started, it still espouses the same brand promise, it speaks in the same tone, it shares the same value. So people love that consistency, because that consistency then breeds the affinity that is required, or the loyalty, if you want to call it that is associated with your brand. And when you do that, your brands, your audiences are then able to distinguish your brand from the crowd, but they also can be able to tell when it's not you who's speaking. And if you are able to be clear and have a distinguishable brand, have a common lexicon with your stakeholders, make sure that they know you, understand you, and understand your voice, then it enables you to be a brand that can not only communicate effectively, but can do so boldly, because it's got this cadre of followers or potential followers who now know its voice. So as you hail out into the big wide world as a brand, you are able to hail out in a context that understands you, but that is also expecting you as a brand, that is expecting to hear from you. Because earlier I said, you know, you need to be consistent as a brand. You need to make sure that you communicate the right messaging, but that message that you communicate should be aligned with your persona, should be aligned with your brand voice, and aligned with the tone that you have set yourself as an organization that your stakeholders or audiences are familiar with. Now, for you to be able to get the affinity that you require from the brand, and when we really talk about it from a stakeholder alignment and communication perspective, what people are really looking for in your messaging is to see that common thread of your brand promise. People buy into the promise of your brand, and how clear are you as an organization in not only communicating your promise, but living your promise through your services, through your brand engagements, through your products that you deliver into your audience groups. And that really creates that consistency. And most importantly, audiences are looking for brand clarity. Now, with new technology and new technologies, the internet, social media, we are finding that a lot of brands are creating their own confusion so that they can stay ahead of the pack. Whereas what stakeholders are looking for is really brand clarity. They're looking for a brand that is consistent throughout, a brand that shows up simply, a brand that shows up with clarity in whatever context that brand finds itself, so that the audiences don't have to search for you as a brand, because you can imagine the avalanche of information, of brand information audiences are receiving on a daily basis. So what they will go for is brands that are clear, but most importantly, brands that are consistent. Your stakeholders or audiences need to always find you when they need you, but find you where you always should be. So the consistency here is in you making sure that you are not anywhere and everywhere. And later on, I'll speak about niching and about making sure that once you segment your audiences and you know who they are and you create that brand club, if you want to call it that, you need to peg where they'll find you, how they will hear you, when they will hear from you, because consistency it's critical for affinity for stakeholders. And the last but most important one is brand integrity. A lot of brands do not have the integrity that carries the relationships with the stakeholders that they have, but that integrity is also missing in the messaging. As we going into new media and social media where the languaging has become different, a lot of brands are beginning to cut corners in terms of their integrity. And here I'm talking communication integrity, simply because we want to be in with the crowd as a brand. And if you look at the older and more successful brands like Mercedes-Benz, and you see how they are showing up in new media, you can begin to see that they are very consistent. They've maintained their congruency, they've maintained their integrity, they leverage of new technology, but they are not taken over by the storm of the new technologies. And therefore, if you are a brand, you really need to make sure that you spend time in doing brand integrity assurance to make sure that as you measure the impact of your brand and where your brand is showing up, you go back to the basics of your brand strategy so that you are not incongruent with the integrity of your brand. Now, and what are people looking for? As I've said earlier, they want clarity and consistency. And earlier, the question was, how do you then reach your audiences? Much as a lot of things have changed, what hasn't changed is each brand needs to know its audiences. And therefore, if we go back to basics, segmentation to this day remains very critical. You have to be able to know which of your audiences respond to which kind of messaging, to which kind of tool, how much of quantity of engagement or communication or messaging are they able to consume. And so this then begins to negate the concept that when you are driving big brands, you need to go for mass brand communication. So we literally need to go back to the basics of segmentation, knowing your audiences, because once you have segmented, once you know your audiences, you are then in a better position to begin to target your message. And we talk about the issue of communications and PR specialists doing what we say, they spray the information and pray to God it reaches everybody or to whoever they pray to. But the reality is we therefore need to go back to where much as brands can be big, they need to segment their audiences so that even if it's a big picture message, they can target the messaging within the specific groupings within that wider audience universe, because you may find, and I'll use Mercedes-Benz as a target, or even Apple, they may have audiences from your lowest to your highest LSMs, but it is important for them to know of those audiences, what are the preferences of the different stakeholder audiences, and how do they reach those? And if you want your messaging to be effective, you've got to chunk it up for the people in the way that they will consume that information. Most critical, a lot of brands, again, because brands have historically been driven by a push communication, mass media, there is an element where the success of a brand have been limited by their inability to engage their audiences. And therefore, my recommendation is we need to go back to basics where our brands are able to engage our audiences. And those engagements need to be in consistent communication with the brand. So the way you engage with people, again, when I talk about brand congruency, whether you are communicating in different platforms, people need to see your brand integrity. They need to see congruence in the way you engage with them as audiences. And really, we have been pushed in terms of new medias to go to a lot of written communication, but I think there is an opportunity with what new medias also provide for us to leverage verbal and non-verbal ways of communication. And stakeholders are beginning to respond, or rather discern, to an extent that they are able to see, particularly in the non-verbal communication or even in the verbal communication, how brands present themselves, that whether those brands are congruent. So you would hear people talking about brands that talk the talk but don't walk the talk. And in this context, is therefore important that as a brand, you are cognizant of the fact that once audiences latch onto you, latch onto your messaging, they will then be demanding of a higher level of professionalism and integrity in as far as your brand messaging and communication is concerned. And lastly, which is very critical in this regard, is to create familiarity and a familiar flow of engagement with your audiences. People need to know when and where does this brand communicate? How does it communicate? So that, and the frequency with which this brand communicates, so that people can begin to align with the brand, but to also be in flow or in sync, if you want to call it that, with the brand. And of course, in recommending, and there's a lot of these tools that exist, what I'm really looking to suggest in as far as this is concerned is, I think there is a lot of merit in brands going back to basics of direct communication. Audiences like to feel special, and therefore in your brand communication or brand messaging mix, it is critical that you find ways of directly engaging with your brands, even if it could be your direct media. It could be actually your verbal engagement, where your brand can not only see you in public, but can experience you in their personal spaces, because that is what increases brand affinity, but that is also what enhances brand messaging. And of course, linked to that is the concept of brand engagement. And a lot of, prior to COVID in particular, a lot of brands were very big on brand engagement. But now, post-COVID, there seems to be almost a lag or even an abandonment of brand engagements. And here I'm talking about physical engagements where clients can touch, feel, experience the brand in motion. So there's almost a recommendation for brands to actually go back to finding creative ways. And those engagements don't have to be physical. They could be virtual, but they need to almost bring the human element back into brand engagement, where people are not just receiving an avalanche of adverts, messaging, without seeing the power and the emotions and the heart of the brand. And therefore, enhanced engagement with your stakeholders from a brand perspective, I believe, can definitely increase affinity, but also ensure that your stakeholders stay loyal with that brand for a lot longer. Critical to this, and you were saying it earlier, Sophia, is the issue of new technologies. As I said, in my view, technology will always change. And therefore, it is important that organizations create brand strategies that can transcend the technology. But with that technology that exists, there is an opportunity for us to therefore leverage that technology to customize our brand messaging. And again, when you segment your stakeholder groupings, depending on which brand that you are, look at your technology mix and begin to plug in your different stakeholders into the different technologies, because not everybody has a preference for the technologies that exist, and therefore there's an opportunity for brand practitioners to actually do a lot more work in understanding and mapping their stakeholders to technology preferences in the same way they used to map their stakeholders to the various communication media and mixes that existed in the past, and that continues to exist depending on where the brand finds itself. And once you have done that, you are then able to know which brand suits which ones. And I mean, I work in environments where you have a largely older audiences that do not respond to technology as well. And therefore, you're still finding people pushing technology, even in a context where those kind of stakeholders do not respond to technology as much. Or you can even have a much younger audience in your branding mix who actually do love technology, but do not have the time for long-windedness in the technology framework. And therefore, as you look at those stakeholder audiences, it becomes critical for you to then customize the messaging, have an overarching brand message, but chunk it up and customize it for the benefit of your stakeholder grouping so that you can have the maximum impact that you require. Because once you've done that customization, matching the mix, the messaging and the audiences, it becomes easier for you to therefore evaluate the impact or the efficacy of your brand message and whether your messaging are reaching the right people at the right time and in the right format of communication. Most importantly, which is something that we really need to be cognizant of, obviously, as brands, is making sure that as a brand, you show up in the right places and in the right conversation. And as I said earlier, there is a temptation for brands in this very busy world, as they clamor for competitiveness or for competition, to want to be anywhere and everywhere. Now, if you look at your audiences and your stakeholders who become a lot more discerning, it is important that brands are cognizant of the fact that they need to know where to show up, when to show up, but also brands are now required to be more responsible and more responsive. So gone are the days when you could have muted brands, and therefore in the national and the social discourses of the various contexts in which the brands find themselves, there is now an added requirement for brands to not just show up, to show themselves and as who they are as a brand, but to be able to participate in the right conversation. So if you are a brand such as Nike, all of a sudden you are required to participate in issues of human rights, child labor, and those kinds of conversations. And when we talk about brand integrity, people are looking for those kind of activities from a brand, such that the brand is not just about selling the service, selling the product, but people need to see the brand conscious and the brand conscience and the brand consciousness within the context in which these brands find themselves. The most important aspect in my view is also you cannot as brands continue to do anything and everything and be everywhere. And therefore there's a proposition for brands to put the effort where it's required. And in this case, brands have got different stakeholder groupings. And I've just literally looked at 3 major groupings. You have your brand loyalists. These are people who will ride or die with your brands. And in my view, you need to put a lot of effort in making sure that you keep these people on site. You make sure that they continue to understand your brand, to see where your brand is going, such that even if there's a brand transformation and brand transition, these are the people that you need to take on board, because they will be able to go with you wherever their brand goes, because they've bought into their why, their loyalty is beyond your product or your service, and therefore you need to put an effort in making sure that you keep them on board. And then you've got a second level audience, which is your neutrals. These are people who are agnostic to your brand. They would buy your brand, but they really don't care as much about your brand, and they also don't have a problem with your brand. And therefore there's an opportunity when you're engaging with the neutrals to leverage on bringing them on board to become your loyalist. And that you can only be able to do if you have segmented, if you have targeted messaging to them, such that how you talk to your loyalists, how you talk to your neutrals, it's completely different, because on the one, you are trying to keep them on board. On the others, you are trying to swing them towards your brand. And that then talks to the fact that you cannot have a one-size-fits-all kind of messaging when it comes to your brand. The other people are what I call your brand negators. No matter what you do, how you do it, some people will just never buy into your brand. And I find that there's a lot of brands that are really spending a lot of time in really working a mole, if I can call it that, where they literally chase this brand negators, trying to convince them and convert them. But the truth is, brand negators are not aligned to your brand at an ideological level. And therefore, until and unless your brand ideology changes, which is highly unlikely, these brand of stakeholders are never going to be aligned or have affinity to your brand. And therefore, if you look at how to communicate effectively with them as well, obviously you do not want to leave them unattended, because they can damage your brand. But the kind of effort that you put into the stakeholder groupings has got to be an effort that enables you to give them enough information that they do not find any reason to damage your brand. But in my view, there should be no effort whatsoever that is being put in trying to convert these people, simply because if you look at what we had said earlier in terms of Simon Sinek's views, that the people buying the why, these people don't believe in your why now, it's highly unlikely that they will believe you in your why in the future. As we had said earlier, in terms of messaging, you need to be channel sensitive. Again, different stakeholders respond to different channels, whatever they may look like. There are some people who still prefer their old style print, and it's important for them to go into that environment. Some people prefer direct, some people prefer direct communication face-to-face, and we are seeing a lot of people beginning to demand for that because of what COVID has denied them, and people begin to talk about the personalization of brands. But some people just prefer new medias, whatever the channels look like for those stakeholder audiences. It is therefore important for you as the person driving the brand engagements to be channel sensitive, to know what are the opportunities and the possibilities of that channel and how you can leverage that channel for maximum impact and engagement with your stakeholders. And most importantly, if your messages land into that channel, will they find expression or will they be lost in the mix? And if they don't find expression and are lost in the mix, how do you then package your messaging in that channel so that they remain relevant, they remain top of mind, they are sought out by your brand loyalists and potentially your neutrals, and to some extent your negators, because their job is to actually follow your brands and wait for opportunities to punch holes or attack your brands. Most importantly, obviously, and that's just my last recommendation, is you need to be relevant. And relevance here depends on the nature of the brand, it depends on context, but any stakeholder that is going to respond to any brand, largely because we are dealing with discerning stakeholders, needs to be relevant. And in the relevance, you can begin to include things like, is your messaging on time? Is it the right amount of messaging? Is what your audiences are looking at and for at that point in time, given the context in which they find themselves? And lastly, but most importantly, your brand needs to be available. And really, with a lot of stakeholders that are becoming discerning, there is a lot of demand for brands to be available to their stakeholders. People are no longer just looking at billboards, advertising. They want to find expression in the way the brand communicates. They want to find themselves also in how the brand kind of includes them in how it engages, because they need brands to recognize that they exist. They need brands that actually integrates them in their messaging, in their mix, such that when you talk about your service and your products, you now recognize that people actually do drive products and services. And as you integrate those people into your brand, and that's why you're seeing a lot of brand testimonial advertising, some of the other brands are beginning to see that it is important to show, to reward loyalists by putting them into the brand mix. And here you look for people who are like your loyalists in terms of your availability, but most importantly, in terms of availability, when your stakeholders want you, they should be able to find you. When the stakeholders have got challenges with your brand, be it customer complaints or whatever, they need to be able to get you to be responsive, because important in the communication efficacy is, in as much as your top-down messages need to be spot on, your ability to respond to bottom-up messaging also need to be just as spot on. And so in conclusion, I think, look, a great brand is a story that is never completely told. And this is what Scott Bedbury is saying. And a lot of us who are working with brand communication are really trying very hard to tell our stories that morph. But as we do tell those stories, we never must lose sight of the fact that it cannot be a good story if it doesn't align to the brand promise. It can never be a good story if it's not told in the right way, at the right amount, with the right tone, at the correct voice. But it can never be a good story if it's not a consistent story. And most importantly, it can never be a good story if it doesn't have integrity. And in my conclusion, I'm saying, look, we will never complete telling the story, but as we tell these stories and for audiences to respond, We need to tell these stories with passion. We need to connect to our audiences, and you can only connect that if you have really found that sweet spot in terms of your messaging, found that sweet spot in terms of the tools, but found that sweet spot in terms of accessibility of the mediums that you use to your stakeholders, and most importantly, never cease to get them engaged. And in the words of Tony, a word is a word, a picture is worth 1,000, but a brand is worth 1,000,000. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Thabisile. Quite interesting. The fact that we started with 37 people and we finished with 61 says to itself. And of course, appreciation to your presentation, to the very clear messages and good knowledge you shared with us. Now I have the, first of all, I'm responding to Alfred Kwaku Armu, who is asking about the presentation slide. I just want to tell you that early next week, the whole record of this wonderful masterclass will be on the website of World Communications Forum Association, WCFAglobal.com. So you can follow the slides, the presentation. And of course, I would like kindly and from the bottom of my heart invite you, all of you, to become members and to make a very strong South African group, so we can make we can open an office of WCFA or the Davos Forum in South Africa. We need to have more than 7 members, and I don't think it will be a big issue. So visit the site, see the opportunities to become a full member and to extend your network of communications experts all over the world. Now, questions, ladies and gentlemen. Thabisile Phumo is yours, whatever it means.
Yeah, so Corne, you had a question? Corne?
Hi, Thabisile. No, I was giving you a round of applause because I absolutely loved and appreciated what you shared. I think it was really practical, and I think certainly for me, being in academia, very useful to also share with my students who's either in practice or will soon be in practice. So big appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corne.
Thank you very much. Thabisile, which one is your favorite brand?
I love cars, so Mercedes-Benz is my favorite brand. So I have wasted my time studying that brand. So
Which
yeah.
one? Which one?
Mercedes-Benz.
Sorry, maybe it's a local brand because...
No, Mercedes-Benz, the
Mercedes-Benz,
German
okay.
car.
Mercedes-Benz, it's Guntram Kaiser should be an expert on Mercedes-Benz.
It's my favorite brand. So one day they must just bring me in to just tell them the time I've wasted studying them.
You know the history of Mercedes-Benz? Why Mr. Benz named his famous car Mercedes? Do you know why?
It's that story where the guy who was looking for a racing car and his daughter's name was Mercedes.
Exactly.
Wanted it to be called, and then they just added the name Mercedes to it.
And the chief engineer, do you know the name of the chief engineer of the first Daimler-Benz factory? It's Mr. Maybach. That's true. Maybach was named after the engineer. Do we have any questions to
Mfundo?
Thabisile? Yes, if there is someone, please.
Mfundo?
Hi, Thabisile. Thank you very much for the informative presentation that you have rendered. Actually, it gives me strategies that I can use to approach the content of target audience, because I've got the chapter that I'm going to cover. I suppose that it will be towards end of this next month, May. So it's basically about the diversity of stakeholders and how to engage effectively with your stakeholders as a public relations for your company. So I've got I took some notes, to be honest. I took some notes that I can use to share with my students. And some of the students, I'm glad that they are here. They joined. I saw Zama is here, and I'm thrilled that they've joined and they've witnessed such a beautiful presentation with your brand that you love, Mercedes and the Apple. I could resonate that, oh, okay, Thabisile and I share the same sentiment in terms of the brand. So thank you very much. I don't have a question because I think to everyone, it is always a question in terms of you as the company communicating effectively about your brand, identifying who is your stakeholders, who is your potential stakeholders, and we all rank our stakeholders accordingly. So now I think in the near future, or we need to look at how we should strengthen the relationship with our stakeholders, because I think there is a gap or a lack of practitioners, communication practitioners, in terms of building that relationship with the stakeholders, and also monitoring their stakeholders' perception, opinion about the brand. So I've noticed that there are a lot of brands that people have depicted their opinions, whether they are negative or whether they are positive. But in that platform of communication, you hardly see, you hardly come across with a practitioner that, for example, has provided the feedback. So when is the perfect time to provide the feedback to your stakeholders or to your audience with regard to their perception that they've depicted in those various platforms of communication? So thank you very much, Thabisile, for the informative presentation. It was perfect.
No, thank you so much. And I think what I'm advocating for, and hence I'm talking about going back to engagement and being in flow with your stakeholders and being very consistent. You know, they must hear about you and hear about you all the time and know where to find hearing about you, so that there isn't even a gap in you feeling like there needs to be a plan to give them feedback, because you are in constant flow with them. And honestly, if you want to build a relationship and make sure that your messaging lands with your stakeholders, it is really all about going to basics and building a relationship with them. And hence I'm saying a lot more of your discerning audiences, particularly your loyalists, are looking for direct engagement, whatever that looks like. They are looking for an opportunity to be able to be in touch and in contact with your brand. And therefore, as you begin to do that, some of the issues that they may have in terms of positive or even negative perceptions about you, you are able to consistently address them in that flow, because of the dynamism of the context in which the brand finds expression. Kone?
Hi, Thabisile. So I did think of a question in the meantime. So there's something that's sort of, I think, I don't know, complicating things for me when it comes to stakeholder engagement and messaging. And that is this whole idea of having multiple voices from our stakeholders. And sometimes those voices are, you know, not congruent, they have different interests, and sometimes those interests are even conflicting. And I thought maybe we can pick your brain around, you know, how do we navigate that? Because, you know, there's so many things that we now have to consider as communication practitioners, you know. So we have our stakeholders, we need to map them. There's different ways of mapping them. You know, there's so much available out there. How do we make sense of, you know, what are the best ways, and then finding the sweet spot of communicating the right message at the right time and the right platform, you know, in the right context, et cetera, when there might be contradictory things happening in the space. So that was just something I thought perhaps you can can share some insights. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And that is why the key thing is here is to go back to segmenting, because, and that's why I just gave you 3 broad categories when it talks to brand, where you literally need to know as you segment, because even within your loyalists, there is a further segmentation that has to take place, such that you are able to then know the why part is sometimes sold with your loyalists, but how they want to engage with you even within the loyalist group may be completely different. So there is more required from practitioners to not only be fixated with the mediums, but they've got to really spend a lot of time in the mapping, in understanding preferences, in understanding how people receive information, such that even as you segment, because your loyalists or your neutrals or your negators are not a homogeneous group as well. So as you look into that group and peel the layers, it's almost like an onion peel. When you look at stakeholders, such that you really need to get to the nth degree of understanding how this grouping responds to that and how that grouping responds to that. And I think as practitioners, technology has given us a false sense that everybody receives the message and everybody understands the message the same way. So if we can spend or waste time in that segmentation, in the long run, it becomes easier for your brand to communicate, because you begin to plug in your messaging at the right level. And even if you've got an overarching messaging architecture, that how that message shows itself up in the different categories, even within, say, your loyalists, will be slightly nuanced differently, because people like their own kind of coffee, even if everybody likes coffee. So I guess it's a lot of work for us as practitioners, but that's what makes PR and communication a science, in that a lot of the work that we need to do needs to be in research, needs to be in understanding insights and stakeholders, which then makes it easy for you to plug in the mediums and the messaging, because you've done the bulk of your work where it matters the most. Renee?
Thanks, Tabs. I think the value of your presentation is really positioned in your vast experience of stakeholders. I was thinking, if we have a few minutes still, if you would like to or can please share with us an experience with some of your challenging stakeholders, especially as we know your involvement with the mining communities, and then specifically their diverse groups. What have you found? What are the key challenges that you are faced with as a stakeholder when engaging with those stakeholders? Just a short, brief. I know you can talk a long time around that, but just something
no, it's fine. I'm
close
looking at
to heart.
as well. Look, I think I'll simplify it just so I can articulate it as best as I possibly can. I think the biggest challenge with our stakeholders has really been not understanding who they are, right? So you get into a context and everybody says stakeholders are blue, and the assumption is everybody is blue in that stakeholder universe. And therefore, as you deploy your communication, you deploy communication into a blue context. And what then happens is, as it lands, it gets either accepted, questioned, or rejected. Now, the opportunities that we are finding in what you may call challenges are the fact that stakeholders are now discerning. They are not looking for a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to engagement and communication. And even as you link it to brand, and that's hopefully the point I'm trying to make, that it cannot be a one-size-fits-all. You've got to understand why stakeholders are with you, why your audiences understand you, and why they don't understand you, so that you can be able to bridge, to engage effectively. But one of my biggest learnings, particularly if you look at the extractive industry, is there's been a preoccupation by PR and communication specialists to close the gap. We come from that context of trying to close the gap in how we engage and how the messages land. And I'm advocating, with just my limited experience in that space, that there actually is no need to close the gap. What you almost want to do with your media mix, with your messaging, is to build a bridge. so that you and your stakeholders can be able to transact both ways, meet each other in the middle, sometimes on the either side of the bridge. Because when you stop to try to close the gap, you are then not dealing with those issues of trying to convince people of ideology, trying to meet people at their contexts. But now you are trying to create a flow between you and the stakeholders so that there's an understanding on where you guys sit on both polarities and where you need to meet on issues of mutual interest. And in branding, that's quite critical because there is a mutual interest between the brand consumer and the company. And therefore, don't try to close the gap. Just literally find a bridge where you can transact either side. Just, and as I always make a joke of it, just make sure nobody falls off the bridge, because it is your job as a PR practitioner to make sure that the guardrails on your bridge are high enough for you to keep your audiences interested, captivated, and alive, and associating with your brand in the short and medium term, and even long term, depending on the kind of brand that you are driving. Okay, I don't see any questions. Maxime and Sophia, back to you, and thank you so much for the opportunity from my side and for the questions asked. Back to you, Maxime and Sophia. Oh, so I see Mfundo is not asking questions.
Thanks a lot. Your speech was absolutely amazing, and so many questions after that. It's best proof that it was inspiring, insightful, and I'm very sure that after seeing the recording, you will see, a lot of comments to the presentation, and all of them are super positive. So from the bottom of my heart, I would like to say thanks for this amazing time, and for all your questions, comments, and engagement. So please all be invited on our next master classes. Maxime, the last word.
Yes, thank you very much, Sophia, and of course, respect Thabisile. Our next masterclass will be on May 12th, and we will have a very interesting presenter who some of you may know. Her name is Amanda Coleman. Amanda was the PR director of the police department, if I'm not mistaken, in Manchester, but she wrote, PR director of a police department, that means that she's a surgeon on crisis, because they solve crisis every day or every week or every hour. She wrote extremely interesting book about the crisis management, to which I wrote a blurb or a foreword, and I have it somewhere here in the office. So Amanda will presenting on May 12th. All of you will receive an invitation, and I predict that this masterclass will be also as much interesting as it was today's masterclass of Thabisile. Let me wish you, all of you, next nice weekend, good relax, and again, come to our website, dear friends from beautiful South Africa. Become members of the World Communications Forum, and what I can say at the end is Kosi Sikelela, Africa.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Amandla Ngawetu. Bye-bye.